Okay, we'll get started. So thank you, Chaim, for giving share last night. You did a lot more in one evening than I did in 2 evenings. So I'll accept the musar. But it's very, very sadistic. Yes, Gemara. Thank you so much. So we are at the bottom of Chaf Vav Amud Beis 26b at the 2 dots, right? So we are paraphrasing our Mishnah, and our Mishnah quoted for us that there was a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tana Kama and the other Tana in the Mishnah as to when a person's opportunity for tefillah expires. So this part of the Gemara is paraphrasing the line where it says Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ad Dalet Shos, which means the person has until the 4th hour of the day. The Gemara asks a very simple question, which is Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ad Arba Shos Yibayilhu. Those in the Beis Medrash had the following question: Ad ve'ad b'chlal, or tilma ad v'lo ad b'chlal. You say till the 4th hour. It's very unclear what that means. Does it mean up until the 4th hour? Or do you include the 4th hour, which means really till you'll get all the way up to the 5th hour? So a very simple question, but the difference is going to be a matter of 1 full hour. Remember, all the hours that we talked about over here are not necessarily 60-minute hours. They'll average out at approximately 60 minutes, but the hours we're talking about are shos, zmanios, which is from sunrise to sunset, and you take all those minutes and divide it by 12, and then whatever is going to be left over, that's going to be your shos zmanios. So the Gemara says, Tashma, let's try to look at our Mishnah and try to prove from the Mishnah whether when we say until 4 hours, that includes the entire 4th hour, which takes you till the 5th hour, or it stops as soon as you hit the 4th hour, which really means you get to go all the way through the 3rd hour, but once you come to the 4th hour, you're done. Gemara says, let's look at our Mishnah. Yehuda Omer, Yehuda says, Ad plag ha-mincha. When it comes to mincha, he tells us, he uses the word ad, he tells us you have until plag ha-mincha to daven mincha. Now, the word ad is exactly the same. So whatever ad means when we're talking about plag ha-mincha, ad is going to mean we're talking about the hours of the day. If you want to explain that ad means up until that point, but you don't include the mentioned point. So therefore, when it says ad dalet shos, you don't include the 4th hour, but you stop at the 4th hour, then that will make sense as to where you're going to find the difference between Yehuda and the Rabbanan. Let's just explain this really very quickly again. You have, mincha is going to be at 9.5 hours in the day. So what that means is you have 2.5 hours until the end of the day. So from mincha, which is 9.5 hours into the day, until the end of the 12th hour, you'll be left with 2.5 hours. Plaga mincha is cutting that in half. You have 1 hour and a quarter. So 1 hour and a quarter is your plaga mincha. So if you have up until plag ha-mincha, that means once you bump into that plag mark, you're done. That would be ad v'lo ad b'chlal. That means up until plag, but you can't include that last chunk of time, which is from that last hour and a quarter till the end, till 12, till sunset. Now, if you're going to tell me ad v'ad b'chlal, then when we say ad, we actually use it as an inclusive term to mean up until this point and including that point, then Rabbi Yehuda hainu d'Rabbanan. We are actually just semantically saying exactly the same thing. It's a difference of semantics, because when you say ad plaga mincha, if ad means including plaga mincha, that means I'm going to include that entire last hour and a quarter, which will take me up until Shkia Sachama, which is exactly the same thing as what the Rabbanan told us. So therefore, we're stuck without any difference between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. Therefore, the Gemara wants to say, we're at the top of Chav Zayin with Aleph, Ella Mai, it must be, what is it? Ad v'lo ad b'chlal. We're pretty much convinced at this point in time that ad must mean up until, but not including that period of time. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Shachris goes through the 3rd hour and stops abruptly at the 4th hour. Mincha goes up until that hour and a quarter mark before Shkia, and stops abruptly over there. Does not include that last chunk of time. The Gemara says, hold on a second. We can't stop here, because we have to read the rest of the Mishnah. Ema Seifa. Now let us look at the Seifa, the last line of the Mishnah. B'shal Musafim. When is a person allowed to daven Musaf? Kol hayom. He has the entire day to daven Musaf. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ad Sheva shows you have up until 7 hours. So now, in the language that we're using, up until 7 hours means you have the entire 6th hour, but as soon as you hit hour 7, you're done. So that means you could include the 6th hour of the day, which basically takes you to midday, because if there's 12 hours, the 6th hour is going to be midday. So then we're going to have a problem with the subsequent brisa. So let's read what goes on over here. Betanya, we have a brisa which says, Hayu lefanav shtei tfilos. A person finds themselves in a situation where they have 2 tfilos where they should be davening. Achas shel musaf, v'achas shel mincha. The person finds himself at a period of time in the day. He did not daven musaf yet, but it's already mincha time. Now, what's the halacha? The Gemara tells us, Mispalal shel mincha, v'achar kach shel musaf. A person should daven mincha first, and then musaf afterwards. As strange as this sounds, essentially what's happening, you have shachris, then you'll daven mincha, and then you daven musaf afterwards. This can come up on a typical Shabbos. It's not so relevant, because even if you daven in a shul that starts late and has a pretty long davening, most shuls are not going to pull the davening in the morning all the way up until mincha time. It happens sometimes in the winter. It could also happen on Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, we have a very long shachris. Then you have Kriyas HaTorah. If it took a long time, you might find yourself in a period of time when it's already mincha time, you didn't daven musaf yet. So what's the halach when you find those cases? And it happens to be this machlokas is not relevant over there. Why? Because when you're davening with tzibor, when you're davening with the kehillah, you always follow the system, because once you change the system, you have to realize, especially in a shul like this, you can have hundreds of people there, and they say, oh yeah, that shul, I actually daven there on Yom Kippur. People are pretty firm on Yom Kippur, and they actually daven mincha before musaf. So it's the minhag in that town, they daven mincha before musaf, so you can end up spreading false minhagim. So therefore, when it comes to tzibor, we always daven musaf before mincha. But either way, in this case, we're talking about a case where a person has the tefillah of musaf, which is undavened, the tefillah of mincha, which is undavened, and they find themselves in a period of time where they could daven both. What's the halacha? The Brachos tells us, you daven mincha first, v'achar kach shel musaf goes afterwards, and the Brachos explains, shezu tedira, v'zu eino tedira. Mincha is a constant. Every single day, you have musaf. The halacha is tadir, v'she'eno tadir kodem. Whenever you have a constant which lines up against something which is not so constant, it's not as frequent, you always do the constant first. There are some exceptions to the rule, but that's beyond the scope of today's share. Rabbi Yehuda says, Mispal shel musaf, a person should daven musaf first, v'achar kach shel mincha, and after he finishes davening musaf, he should daven mincha, shezu overes, v'zu eino overes. Musaf is going to expire. Mincha is not going to expire for a long time, and therefore a person should daven musaf first. Now that fits perfectly with Rabbi Yehuda from our Mishnah. The Tana Kama in our Mishnah told us musaf gives you got a whole day for musaf. Daven musaf whenever you want. Rabbi Yehuda says no, your musaf expires at 7 hours. So therefore he says, because I'm of the opinion that musaf is going to expire, daven musaf first, and then daven mincha. Now, thinking about this, Iyamr b'shlama ad va'ad b'chlal. If you want to tell me that whenever Rabbi Yehuda says ad, which means until, his intention was until and including that time that I'm going to mention. It's perfectly understandable how a person could find himself in that 1 hour when they're allowed to daven musaf and mincha. Think about it. It makes sense, because if ad v'ad b'chlal, that means from hour 6 till hour 7, you could still daven musaf. And we know in the last half hour of the 6th hour, that's when you could daven musaf. So you find yourself 6.5 hours into the day, you didn't daven musaf yet, so you're allowed to daven mincha and musaf during that half hour. It makes sense. However, if you're telling me that according to Rabbi Yehuda, ad means up until, but not including that next period of time, how are you going to find yourself in a situation where you're both allowed to daven musaf and mincha? Kivan the asila shel mincha, once you're already 6.5 hours into the day, az the la shel musafim. Musaf already expired. Because if musaf's allowed to go up until the 7th hour, which means that really only up until, but it stops earlier, so then as soon as that hour comes, your musaf is opportunity expired, and then mincha comes about, and therefore the whole scenario would never come about. Therefore, elamai, we must have to say ad ve'ad b'chlal. Then we have to say ad actually means up until that period of time. The Gemara says, very nice, but now you find yourself stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because either way you're going to learn it, you're going to have a problem. We proved earlier that ad must mean not inclusive, otherwise Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda are going to be the same thing when it comes to mincha. So then what are we going to do? When it comes to a musaf, we find ourselves having a problem with this brisa, so therefore we say it is inclusive. But we find ourselves stuck. Either it's inclusive and it's a problem for the machlokes of mincha, or it's not inclusive and the brisa doesn't make any sense. The Gemara says, kasha reisha. I have a problem with the first case. The Gemara says, Ma'ika bein Rabbi Yehuda Rabbanan, Ma'ika bein Yehuda Rabbanan, the question we asked earlier. The Gemara says, Mi savret tehai plag mincha, plag achrona. You misunderstood the entire understanding of plag mincha. You thought they were talking about the second half. Remember, if you cut that 2.5 hour period in half, you get 2 halves. That's just how it works. You get an hour and a quarter at the beginning, an hour and a quarter at the end. So now you thought that we were dealing with that last piece. No. We were talking about the first one. Mi savret tehai plag mincha, plag achrona was the second half, which is really from an hour and a quarter to 2.5 hours. No. We're not to plag mincha achrona kamar, plag rishona kamar. We're referring to the first hour and a quarter. So from 9.5 hours into the day, up until another hour and a quarter, that's what we were talking about when we had the discussion. V'hachi kamar, this is what he meant to say. Emas nafik plag rishona v'ayel plag achrona. When do you have the first half going away and the second half coming in? Michi nafki yud aleph shos chasravia, which is 10 hours and 3/4. 10 and 3/4 hours into the day. So therefore, we no longer have a conflict between, I should say, really not a conflict. We don't have a problem that mincha is going to be exactly the same opinion, just semantically presented differently. It's not the same. Because even if you're going to say that it includes the last piece, it still only goes till 10 hours and 3/4 into the day. It won't go all the way up till sunset. Amar Nachman. Nachman said, Afanana mitnina. We also have a brisa which says the same thing. Yehuda ben Bava Heyed Chamisha Dvarim. This is quoting a Mishnah in Idios. Idios is a Masechta where they wrote it in one day. They called all the Rabbanan, all the scholars together and said, listen, we want to make sure that everything's recorded. If you have any information that you can report to us, which you think might be forgotten, here's your opportunity. Come by and report it today. So a lot of the statements that are going to be made are going to be completely unrelated one thing to the next. I'm sure there's somebody who's able to make some kind of connection between all these statements, but at face value, there's no connection. And he said the following 5 things. Number 1, shememainin es a katana, that you could do miyan with a katana. What is miyan? Just very quickly, don't want to spend too much time on the sugya of yibum and miyan. We did this in Yavamas and Kiddushin. Miyan is when a child gets married off by their sibling or mother as a kata. So this is not talking about, now the pasuk tells us the father can marry off his child. That's real kiddushin. The father marries off his child who's a katana, his daughter is a katana, so she's married. If the father dies, then her brother or her mother can marry her off, but that's kiddushin midrabanan. Therefore, because it's only rabbinic kiddushin, she could just walk out. She doesn't need to have a get. She could do miyan and walk out. Now what this means is, there are cases when we tell her to walk out. When is that? If she and her sister both got married to 2 brothers, and unfortunately, her brother-in-law died. Okay, her brother-in-law died without children, therefore leaving her husband with the mitzvah of yibum. Her husband's supposed to marry her sister-in-law. The problem is that her sister-in-law is his wife's sister. So, a lot going on in the family here. Basically, 2 siblings married 2 other siblings. The older one, the Gedola's husband died. Now she should marry that brother. The problem is that brother's married to her. We tell her, since your kiddushin is only midrabanan, walk out, just leave, and now your husband or ex-husband or husband who really retroactively never was your husband can go ahead and marry the sister. That's the first case. It's not relevant to our Gemara. Next one.
She was never married before. She married a Kohen then?
We'll discuss it another time. Okay. And we're allowed to allow a woman whose husband got lost, who disappeared, with the testimony of just one person. This is a special leniency that we employ for an aguna. We don't want a woman to be stuck. Her husband got lost. There's no way for us to find him. If you have one aid, even though generally speaking, we do not allow anything to do with marriage to take effect with less than 2 aidim, in this case, we'll allow it. Again, it's a very large sugya where it comes up, but it's not for now. Next, Tunval Tarnagol Shaniskol B'Yerushalayim Al Shahargas Nefesh. Generally speaking, when we talk about killing an animal for murder, it's generally going to be a very large animal. This halacha was that even if it's a chicken, even if a chicken managed to kill somebody, pecked away at someone's head and killed them, you actually kill the chicken. Yayin, in other words, grape juice, which sat for 40 days, loses its status as grape juice and becomes wine. It starts to ferment. That period of time, you could use it on this beach. Val tamid, here's the line that was important. Val tamid shel shachar shekarev barba shos. Tamid shel shachar is going to be offered in the 4th hour. What does that mean? Shma mina ad v'ad b'chlal. We see very clearly that it includes the 4th hour, because it said clearly it was done in the 4th hour. Not ad, be'arba shos, in the 4th hour. Amar of Kahana, halacha Rabbi Yehuda, halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Hayol vitnan b'bechirasa kavosei. Since we learned in bechirasa, idius was considered to be a choicey, very much preferred masechta. It was very much refined. There is something about that masechta which is considered to be choicier than other mesechtas. Therefore, the halachas that are clearly explicit in that mesechta, we pass like that, and therefore davening goes l'chatchila, certainly according to Yehuda, until and including the 4th hour. We'll stop here. Everyone have a wonderful Shabbos.